Just a few years ago, it was almost impossible to imagine that the yuan would become a formidable competitor to the dollar. But the events of recent months have been a cold shower for analysts. According to SWIFT, in March of this year, transactions in yuan exceeded 10% of global operations, marking a historic high. All contracts between China and Saudi Arabia signed in yuan have triggered a domino effect. Brazil and Argentina are now actively making deals with China without using the dollar. And on the Hong Kong and Shanghai exchanges, trading volumes in the national currency have soared 2.5 times compared to last year. Why is this so shocking? For decades, the dollar was not just a currency, it was the symbol of the global financial system. Since the moment America signed the Bretton Woods agreements in the mid-20th century, the dollar became the standard for the entire world. But now, as China builds up its reserves, increases its gold holdings, and offers partner countries the option to move away from dollar settlements, the world map is being redrawn before our very eyes. A particularly alarming signal sounded when India and China began discussing settling payments for energy resources in rupees and yuan. Even Russia, which found itself under harsh sanctions, supported this trend by switching to settlements with Asian countries in national currencies. But if you think this is just impressive statistics, think again. Because behind the dry numbers lies a much more complex game that is about to reveal its true face to the world. On the surface, it seems that China is acting alone. But the reality is much more interesting. South Korea, despite its long-standing military alliance with America, is quietly strengthening its economic ties with China. Trade turnover between these countries has grown by almost 1.5 times over the past 5 years. And for several years in a row, Seoul has been receiving more investments from Beijing than from Washington. Malaysia and Indonesia are not standing aside either. These countries are signing multi-billion-dollar infrastructure agreements with China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and are increasingly discussing how to minimize dollar-related risks. Japan, on the other hand, despite its complicated relationship with Beijing, is showing cautious interest in creating regional financial instruments. This alliance has not yet been formally announced, but experts are already calling it the Asian trade ring. The main goal is to create a resilient network of settlements, supplies, and investments that are independent of American sanctions and dollar fluctuations. And the most troubling thing for the US is that this network is growing not because of political agreements, but through thousands of real deals between businesses. That is precisely why Washington is much more nervous today than it appears in public. Because behind the facade of formal alliances, something is brewing that could change the architecture of the global economy. If you look at the statistics of global reserves, the dollar is still king, with its share exceeding 50%. But if you look at the trend, it becomes clear. The throne beneath it is starting to shake. Just 15 years ago, the dollar accounted for about 70% of global reserves. Today, that figure has dropped by almost 20%. And the main beneficiary of this decline is the yuan. More importantly, central banks in Asia and Africa are increasingly selling off dollar assets and building up their gold reserves. Just last year, China increased its gold reserves by 150 tons, and India by almost 100. These numbers may seem dry, but in practice they mean that Asian countries are starting to prepare for a world where the dollar is no longer the absolute currency. Another alarming sign is the de-dollarization of trade. Russia, China, Iran, India, of these countries are reducing dollar settlements in oil deals. And recently even France made a purchase of liquefied gas in yuan, which was a blow to the familiar dollar system. And here the question arises, what is happening behind the scenes? Why is the dollar losing ground right now when America remains the world's largest economy? The answer lies in the fact that Asia is building an entirely new trade order. When America imposes sanctions or raises tariffs, it counts on countries remaining dependent on Western supply chains. But Asia has learned to act differently. China is building infrastructure projects from Laos to Pakistan. South Korea is investing in factories in Indonesia, and Vietnam is becoming one of the main hubs for electronics manufacturing. This network is not just about trade, it's a full-fledged ecosystem where goods, money, and technology move around American channels. For example, logistics routes through Central Asia allow China and Russia to trade without relying on sea routes controlled by the US. And the creation of joint payment systems like China's SIPS makes it possible to conduct transactions bypassing SWIFT. South Korea, though cautiously, is participating in these projects, understanding that the future lies in multipolar connections. And India, despite its disagreements with China, is also increasingly considering participation in such schemes, especially against the backdrop of the West's attempts to dictate terms. All of this means that before our eyes, a new global framework is taking shape in which the dollar is no longer the main hub. And although many experts still underestimate this transformation, it has already begun to shift the balance of power. For a long time, the global financial system operated according to rules set by the United States. But these rules are starting to fall apart. Sanctions against Russia have shown that the dollar can be turned into a weapon. This has made many countries wonder, what if tomorrow Washington decides to cut them off from dollar transactions? China, seeing this threat, has accelerated the creation of alternative financial channels. South Korea, Japan, and even some Arab countries have begun to diversify their reserves. Meanwhile, Southeast Asian countries are creating regional currency pools that can serve as insurance in case of financial crisis. Interestingly, until recently, the United States itself believed there was simply no alternative to the dollar. But today, that confidence is beginning to crumble. After all, the Asian alliance is demonstrating that the rules can be rewritten if you act cohesively and consistently enough. And here arises the main question: if the old world order is collapsing, what will take its place? The answer lies where interests intersect not only in economics but also in big politics. For a long time, South Korea has been balancing between two giants, the US and China. On one hand, there is the military alliance with America, economic and technological ties, arms supplies, and joint exercises. On the other hand, there is China, the largest trading partner, the main buyer of Korean goods, and an investor on whom almost a third of Korean exports depend. Just 5 years ago, Seoul categorically rejected the possibility of weakening its ties with Washington. But now the situation has changed. Amid trade wars, pressure from the US, and the threat of sanctions, South Korea has begun to cautiously move toward a multipolar model. For example, in the semiconductor sector, Seoul is increasingly working with China despite American attempts to limit these contacts. And in the financial sector, South Korea recently signed a memorandum with China on developing settlements in yuan. Politically, this does not yet look like a break with the US. But economically, Korea is already preparing a backup plan. And this is an extremely alarming signal for Washington. After all, if even the closest allies are starting to think about diversifying risks, it means the old guarantees no longer work. And while many Western analysts reassure themselves with talk of the inviolability of alliances, behind the scenes in Asia, processes are underway that could completely change the rules of the game. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been building an ambitious strategy of economic leadership over the past few years. And today, Beijing is using its resources to dictate terms even to its closest partners. For example, it offers Asian countries loans on preferential terms, but demands that transactions be conducted in yuan. It invests in infrastructure projects, but maintains control over key hubs such as ports, railways, and logistics centers. In South Korea and other countries, this provokes mixed feelings. On the one hand, Chinese money and investment open up enormous opportunities. On the other hand, there is the risk of becoming dependent on Beijing. But strangely enough, it is precisely the fear of the United States that pushes countries in the region to accept China's rules. After all, Washington has proven that it is willing to impose sanctions and block financial channels. Meanwhile, Beijing is acting more softly for now, promising benefits and development. This paradox makes China an extremely dangerous player. It offers an alternative that appears more flexible and safer than the American system. And the longer this standoff continues, the more countries are inclined to at least partially accept the new terms. But behind this soft power lies something more, not just money and technology, but an entirely new architecture of the global economy. Not long ago, it seemed impossible to bypass SWIFT, but China has created its own SIP system, which allows for international payments without the involvement of Western banks. Already today, more than 1,500 financial institutions are connected to this system, and the volume of transactions is growing by almost 20% per year. South Korea, Indonesia, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, all these countries have already started using alternative payment channels. Moreover, the Asian alliance is developing its own digital currencies, which could deal yet another blow to the dollar. The Chinese digital yuan is already being tested in the domestic market, and in the coming years it may reach the international level. This banking revolution is changing not only technology, but also the rules of trust. Whereas previously financial operations were based on American guarantees, now an alternative is emerging, with China becoming the guarantor. And although this still seems risky for now, more and more countries are willing to give it a try. But the most interesting consequences are hidden not in the technology itself, but in how these financial instruments affect the geopolitical balance. Washington is not sitting idly by. The US is actively imposing new sanctions, trying to block the development of Chinese technologies, for example, in the fields of semiconductors and artificial intelligence. They are putting pressure on their allies, including South Korea and Japan, to restrict the supply of equipment to China. Moreover, the US is trying to create its own trade alliances in the Indo-Pacific region to contain Beijing's influence. But the problem is that these measures only have a temporary effect. China is developing its own technologies, creating closed production chains, and Asian countries are finding ways to bypass American restrictions. As a result, Washington's response is looking increasingly desperate. And whereas America used to be able to dictate terms to the whole world, now it has to respond to initiatives coming from Asia. However, this is only the first phase of the struggle. After all, the Asian alliance has a trump card that could radically change the balance of power. The most unexpected tool in the hands of the Asian alliance is gold. While Western countries are betting on financial instruments and digital assets, China and its allies are actively increasing their gold reserves. According to some estimates, over the past 5 years, China has become the largest gold buyer in the world, with India and Russia following behind. Why? The answer is simple. Gold is an independent asset that cannot be frozen or blocked by sanctions. And if the Asian alliance decides to use its gold reserves to back its currencies or for international settlements, this could deal a powerful blow to the dollar system. But it's not just about the numbers. The very fact that Asia is returning to gold symbolizes a rejection of the old rules. It's a show of strength and independence that frightens Western financial centers. And although this trump card is still up their sleeve, many experts are convinced its time is near. This means we're now heading into a crucial and more intense phase of the game where the stakes will undoubtedly be even higher, demanding greater attention and strategic foresight. Energy markets, with their profound and far-reaching influence, have always served as the fundamental bedrock and essential foundation of the entire global economy, underpinning all industrial and commercial activities. And here, the Asian alliance delivers a blow that is hard to overestimate. China has already signed long-term contracts with Russia for gas supplies along the Siberian route. Payments are made not in dollars, but in yuan. Saudi Arabia is discussing with Beijing the possibility of selling oil for yuan, something that was previously considered unthinkable. Iran, under strict sanctions, has completely switched to non-dollar settlements, using Chinese and Indian schemes. But the most important thing is the trend. If until recently almost all oil and gas deals were conducted in dollars, now more and more countries are looking for ways to bypass it. India is buying Russian oil at a discount, paying in rupees and dirhams, while China is launching oil futures in Shanghai denominated in yuan. For the US, this is an alarming signal since the energy market has always been a key lever of Washington's influence, and now that lever is slipping away. And although the dollar still maintains its leadership, its position is already being undermined from different directions. And the most dangerous thing here is that these changes are coming not only from the East, but also from the very heart of Europe. Europe has always been a loyal ally of the US, but the past few years have changed a lot. Sanctions against Russia, trade wars with China, and rising energy prices, all of this is making European countries reconsider their own interests. Germany, the largest economy in the European Union, is suffering losses from breaking ties with Russia, but at the same time is looking for ways to strengthen trade with China. France is signing gas supply deals in yuan, while Italy is discussing participation in the Belt and Road projects. On the one hand, Brussels still follows the NATO line and supports the sanctions. On the other hand, the European business community is actively pressuring politicians, demanding greater flexibility and openness toward Asian markets. This division makes Europe the weak link in the American system. And if the Asian alliance manages to draw the European Union into its orbit, even partially, the consequences for the dollar will be catastrophic. But for now, this process is developing slowly and covertly, and only a few understand how dangerous it really is. At first glance, it may seem that Asia is confidently moving toward victory. But the situation is much more complicated. There are plenty of contradictions within the alliance. India and China are competing for influence in the region. South Korea is wary of becoming overly dependent on Beijing. Malaysia and Indonesia are afraid of falling under China's financial dominance. Moreover, the global financial system is still heavily tied to the dollar. Even if some transactions are conducted in yuan, euros, or rupees, the majority of contracts, loans, and investments remain dollar-based. This means that too abrupt a break could crash not only Western markets but also the Asian players themselves. That's why the alliance acts cautiously, maneuvering between ambition and reality. And this is precisely what makes it even more dangerous. It doesn't break the system all at once, but slowly undermines it from within, preparing for a final blow when America least expects it. Historians like to talk about turning points moments when the old world gives way to the new. And today we are standing right on the edge of such a moment. The rise of settlements in yuan, countries moving out from under the dollar umbrella, the formation of alternative financial and trade alliances, all of this is not just news from the economic pages, but signs of a global shift. The Asian alliance is rewriting the rules of the global game. It shows that the dominance of a single currency is no longer guaranteed. It teaches countries that dependencies can be broken and old chains can be shattered. If this trend continues, the world will look completely different in 5 to 10 years. America still retains its power, but it is no longer unchallenged. Europe is balancing, Asia is advancing, and ahead of us lies not just a battle of currencies, but a clash of entire worldviews, systems, and strategies. The final question: can the yuan really push the dollar aside? Experts are divided. On one hand, the Chinese currency is still not as free as the dollar, and the country's financial system is tightly controlled by the state. On the other hand, China is acting persistently, expanding its spheres of influence, signing hundreds of agreements, creating financial instruments, and accumulating gold. The dollar still accounts for more than half of global reserves and dominates trade and investment. But it is no longer invincible. The yuan is gaining strength. The Asian alliance is growing stronger, while America faces crises and internal challenges. We are on the threshold of a multipolar world, where a single center of power is being replaced by several. And no matter how events unfold, one thing is certain: the era of the dollar's absolute dominance is coming to an end. Which means the game is only just beginning. Many people commonly hold the belief that the ongoing and increasingly significant rivalry between the United States dollar and the Chinese yuan is merely, or at least primarily, a straightforward matter concerning financial aspects and economic competition, but in reality the stakes are much higher. It's about the future of the world order, about who will set the rules and who will have to adapt. China has no intention of stopping where it is. Its alliance with South Korea, Russia, India, Southeast Asian countries, and even part of the Arab world is turning into a powerful bloc capable of redrawing the map of the global economy. And it's not just about settlements in national currencies. It's about logistics, technology, investment, supply chains, and infrastructure. This is an entire parallel system that is being built step by step, slowly but steadily. Washington, of course, is not going to give up either. The US is launching its own initiatives, seeking new alliances, increasing pressure on its allies, and developing innovations. America still remains the world's strongest power, but now its monopoly is being challenged. And this means that we are entering an era of a long, exhausting strategic struggle, where the winner will not be determined in a single day or even a year. The intrigue is heightened by the emergence of new players: Brazil, Africa, and the Middle East. These regions are closely watching the confrontation, waiting for the right moment to take someone's side or to play their own game. The ultimate outcome of the struggle may depend precisely on how these countries act. The world is changing. The yuan and the dollar are no longer just currencies. They are symbols of two worlds, two models of development, two visions of the future. And while some celebrate their initial successes and others count their losses, the most important thing remains behind the scenes. The great game is only just beginning. The final score will not be known tomorrow or even in a year. But one thing is already clear: the era of a unipolar world is over, and those who realize this in time will have a chance to become the masters of the new world.